Donald Robertson, I first want to say it is an honor to get to talk to you today. In my opinion, you are the world's best writer on the connection between ancient philosophy and modern evidence-based applications of psychotherapy. And not only because of the writing and the books that you have, but you are an actual practitioner of cognitive behavioral therapy, and you have been that throughout your career. I could not be more excited to talk to you today.
Oh, that's very nice of you to say so. I'm looking forward to it. Like we were saying earlier, it's kind of my hobby. So, I like to have these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have several of your books behind me, and I have others on ebook. And it's funny. I You're probably known by thousands, if not millions, of people for these more recent books that you've published. Because I also didn't know someone who is very passionate about stress management and resilience until
Mhm.
I was talking to you more recently. You wrote a book back in 2012 called "Build Your Resilience," and you used a lot of
Yeah.
what you write on Substack, and of course, it's weaved throughout your books, but this was very much through the lens of the skill that is resilience.
Yeah, I was asked to write a book about resilience. Again, we were talking earlier about stumbling into things. I think a publisher just emailed me and said, "Hey, do you want to write?" To this day, I don't really know why they contacted me. Like they emailed me a long time ago, like 15 years ago, and said, "Do you want to write a book about resilience?" And I was like, "Sure." For the Teach Yourself series, which is like a popular kind of series, educational series, and I wrote a book on resilience. And then I wrote another book for the same series. I said I'm kind of even more into Stoicism, and so I wrote a book called Teach Yourself Stoicism, uh, basically a whiles back. So yeah, resilience. And in that book, there's some references to Stoicism. There's a lot of stuff in it about third wave cognitive behavioral therapy and some second wave stuff. I was trying to kind of think about the concept of resilience from a more modern psychotherapy point of view. It seemed to me like some of the stuff in resilience was a little bit dated in some ways. So it's something that I've always been interested in. I think the Stoics, in some ways, are more about resilience. One thing we could say about resilience is basically prevention, basically. So therapy is remedial. Like you've got a problem and you come and see a therapist. You go, here's my problem. Could you help me undo it or fix it? And so therapy always arrives too late on the scene, in a sense. It's kind of cleaning up a problem that's already happened. But as everybody knows, prevention is better than cure. And resilience is more about getting in there early and preparing people to cope with adversity or stress, so they're less likely to develop these problems in the first place. And the Stoics were all about that. We associate Stoicism with cognitive behavioral therapy, but they were kind of more about prevention or resilience building in a sense.
Absolutely. And you learned a little bit about me when I shared my bio with you and we were talking. And it's very funny the timing of you publishing that book, because that was just as I was getting ready to enter the Navy. And within a year, I'd be getting formally trained on the program that the Navy Marine Corps stood up back in 2007 to address high rates of burnout. Like you said, later down the line, unaddressed problems,
Yeah,
just whether it's due to wear and tear over time or, of course, acute injuries that happen to your psychology. But that I'd always been passionate about not knowing, like really using the word resilience, but just stress that I was aware of in my life and why some people manage certain stressors well and others not so much. And
yeah,
that created this journey of teaching stress management in the military, but then really starting to look at it through the lens of resilience. And I couldn't agree more that early intervention, or even better yet, prevention, is
mhm,
ideal for us to be able to manage what's on our plate. I like to define resilience as the ability to effectively manage and then eventually recover from
yeah.
stress.
And what could be more preventative than a whole philosophy of life? So I think that's why stoicism tends to appeal from that perspective. People are always asking me about stoicism and therapy, and I say, well, really, the holy grail of mental health is resilience, and stoicism lends itself far more to a long-term preventative approach than it does to clinical practice or therapy, right? It's kind of relevant to both, but it's especially holds out potential as a kind of Western yoga in a way that might have properties for building resilience. One of the problems with CBT is that, insofar as it's kind of skills based, Like the difficulty with teaching people skills in general is that they stop doing them after a while. Like it's just kind of annoying. You teach these people perfectly good skills, and then a year or 2 years later, they kind of forget about them and sort of revert back to their old habits often. So sometimes what we find is with CBT can have benefits for a year, 2 years, 3 years, yeah, and then there's a bit of backsliding or kind of relapse or whatever of certain types of problems. Whereas Stoicism is permanent, like it's potentially sticky because people get into it and they often remain into it like for the rest of their lives. So one of the reasons I think it holds out a lot of potential is the very idea of it, something people identify with at a deeper level. The way I illustrate that, it might seem a little bit cute to make this point, but I'm deadly serious about it, is I've never really met anyone with a CBT tattoo, right? But you wouldn't believe how many people have got Stoicism tattoos. They send me photographs of them. And there's whole web pages where people have got collections of photographs of Marcus Aurelius and Stoic quote tattoos, right? And the point is that those guys identify with Stoicism like it's a religion to them. So it's not just going to be like here's a bunch of stress management techniques, take them or leave them. Maybe you'll use them for a while, then maybe you might forget about them later. But to give them something that they actually identify with as a worldview, philosophy, and way of life clearly holds out more potential for lasting improvement, might be permanent, like, which would be, a big deal. Like, that would be a great victory if we can take what we know from CBT and things like that and stress management and present it to people in a way that actually becomes part of their whole worldview.
That's really interesting, and the point you made about no one having CBT tattoos is hilarious. But you said identity quite a few times, and when you talk about a practical philosophy that is Stoicism, it's resonated with so many people throughout the years and had this resurgence in the past few decades due to writers like yourself, Ryan Holiday, and many others. But it's because it's so common sense and it breaks things down into such easy lenses, first with our perspectives and impressions of the world, but then also things that we can actually do. It makes so much sense that people identify with that more and then embody it. Whereas, like you said, simple strategies that you teach you, skills,
Yeah.
maybe they become habits, maybe they don't. But as you live on, maybe that can wear away. But if your identity's there, that can sustain.
There's something else that's missing from CBT, and it sounds again odd to say this, but I've always said this, right? It's a surprise, it's a paradoxical observation that I'm about to now make, which is in the ancient world, there was always a kind of conflict or a kind of tension between the sophists and the philosophers. And the sophists were teachers of rhetoric. They used language in order to persuade people of things, where the philosophers were more interested in reason and logic and getting to the truth. So this might seem like a surprising observation, but we have only maybe less than 1% of the original Stoic writings that survive today, and they mainly come from Imperial Roman era Stoics, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. I mean, actually, Marcus Aurelius is pretty much the last Stoic standing that we hear about, oddly, because it's suggested that he started a kind of fad for Stoicism. It became popular because he was known for it and he was the emperor. But we hear virtually nothing about the Stoics after that. That's 500 years, though, after the Stoic school was originally founded. So things like Marxism and psychoanalysis, have kind of lasted for, 100 years or whatever. And then they kind of like start to fizzle out. Or Stoicism thrived as a philosophy for 5 centuries in the ancient world before it gradually kind of started to fade out from history. And it went out with a bang with Marcus Aurelius in a way. And it's a puzzle in a sense why it didn't why we don't hear much about it being popular after that. But there's something odd about these guys. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, was mocked for not being a very good speaker, not being a great orator, speaking in kind of simplistic terms and using very concise and kind of abrupt arguments and so on. And the Stoics in general were viewed as not the best orators and so on. However, the guys that we know about, Seneca was one of the greatest writers of antiquity. Marcus Aurelius, contrary to what people sometimes say, was a great writer. He was highly trained in Greek and Latin rhetoric for decades by the leading experts during his lifetime, by Herodes Atticus and Fronto. And Epictetus was not a great orator by conventional standards, but Epictetus never wrote anything. Everything that we have from him is written down by Arrian, who is a highly successful, highly educated, and trained writer who's basically editing and transcribing the words of Epictetus. So I don't think that's a coincidence, right? What we have surviving from the Stoics might be some of the best writing that the Stoics produced in terms of the quality, the use of language. Marcus Aurelius, in particular, was trained throughout his lifetime to be very judicious in selecting images and metaphors in his writing. We can see in his letters to Fronto that Fronto's telling him to do this. He says, if you want to convey wisdom, you have to come up with exactly the right image, the right metaphor that really kind of hits the nail on the head. You can see Marcus doing that in the Meditations. Now, the point being that we have these exceptionally high quality, highly refined writings that survive from the Stoics. It would be like having CBT books that are written by Shakespeare or something like that, right? I think that's part of the reason that people identify with the Stoics is that they often have a way with words. And that makes the things that they say emotive and memorable. So they really can. That's why people get things, quotes from the Stoics tattooed on them, right? I mean, Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, the founders of CBT, sometimes say quite cool things, but they're not Shakespeare. Right. They're not like historically great figures in literature. But Stoicism happens to come down to us curated through that kind of lens. These are these particularly polished and high quality, highly acclaimed writings. And so we've got these great ideas, common sense ideas that form the inspiration for cognitive behavioral therapy, but we've also got them in the form of these profound and beautiful writings.
So we need to find really cool psychologists to make
Yeah,
CBT like and sophists that can speak to it well. So I know it actually we're living in a few decades right now where there are enormous names of different types of psychologists that are popularizing different ideas. So maybe we're actually living in a time where people will start getting tattoos of different types of psychology on them. But that's a really interesting point. The writers were not necessarily the names that we know themselves, but they were able to articulate what they were saying in a way that is quite
yeah.
memorable.
Seneca and Marcus Aurelius very much thought of themselves as basically just taking the ideas of Zeno and Chrysippus, like ideas that were many centuries old by that point, and just polishing them and paraphrasing them and articulating them in a more contemporary, more expressive way. Right. That's really what we're dealing with when we deal with those guys is people that were really good at curating these ideas and conveying them in an effective way to us. So I think that's part of that's why Stoicism resonates with people, because it took 500 years to refine the ideas and the expression of them to that point.
When it comes to stoicism, and there are many lessons, and some that I derive more specifically from certain philosophers than others. You've had several posts recently on like 5 lessons from stoicism that stayed with you for resilience. I love that post, like many of yours. What are some of the primary lessons that have resonated most with you that have endured your writing back from 2012 when you wrote Build Your Resilience, probably to some changes to today?
From Stoicism, let's pick out a couple of practical ideas, because it's nice to kind of talk about what Stoicism means in the bigger picture, but it's also good to give people some practical ideas. So when I wrote my first book on Stoicism, I listed all the psychological techniques that I could identify. Pierre Hadot, a French scholar, had already kind of done the groundwork by documenting what he called spiritual exercises. But for some weird reason, he never connected it to psychotherapy or modern psychology. So I thought that kind of handed it to me in a plate. It was quite easy to take that, then compare it to therapy. And I identified not 2 or 3 psychological techniques, but there were about 18 distinct psychological practices that I could find in ancient Stoicism. So with the Stoics, we have a big toolbox of techniques, actually. And even then, some of those individual techniques we could kind of divide down further into several variations. So let's look at some of the things that they actually suggest doing. I think one of the main things, some of these things are really linked to their philosophy, but one of the main things is that Stoicism is a virtue ethic. So they constantly want to remind us to do what they call an epistrophe, like a U-turn in our whole perspective on ethics. Because most people, the prevailing values of our society are such that we place a lot of value on external outcomes. And, like say you're an author, you might think, I want to write a best-selling book or something like that. I want to get lots of good reviews. That's something that happens in the future that may or may not happen. Um, but the Stoics want us to shift our perspective onto process values, and in particular, our character traits. So the way that we do stuff. So if I'm being wise or compassionate or creative, for example, those are traits that I could exercise moment to moment in my life. So this shift in perspective to putting more emphasis on the way that we do things rather than on the external outcome in life generally contributes fundamentally to psychological resilience. So it's really just the core of virtue ethics in general, which was kind of common to some extent across almost all schools of ancient philosophy, right? Um, so to link it to something that we know today, like this idea in the last 2 or 3 decades has become central to a lot of modern psychotherapy. Particularly, the example I would normally give is a thing called behavioral activation, which is the leading clinical treatment for depression. It's one of the leading clinical treatments for depression. And behavioral activation revolves almost entirely around getting people with clinical depression to shift their focus more onto cultivating certain intrinsic values or character traits, basically, because that tends to lead to a sense of flourishing and fulfillment and purpose in life. And that's kind of where they have a deficit, it seems. But it can help other people as well. So here's where the philosophy and the techniques start to intersect. Like shifting more to this perspective, I think is something that lifelong can potentially contribute to our resilience. So the Stoics said that virtue is the only true good. Now, if somebody believes that, if they genuinely grasp that idea and embrace it fully, that implies that external stuff like wealth and reputation is of secondary value at most. So that would mean that if your reputation is damaged or you go bankrupt and lose all of your wealth, it's not the end of the world because those things weren't all important to you in the first place. There was something even more important, which is how you cope with adversity. Your attitude, the way that you respond, your own character was fundamentally from the outset more important to you than any of these things which fate can potentially take away from us. So that's one sense in which Stoicism is intrinsically a resilient philosophy of life. It's baked into the very values, the very ethic that underlies Stoicism. And that's kind of validated by what we find in modern clinical research. That's actually a concept that there's a little bit of there's something similar in resilience training programs where they, insofar as they sometimes incorporate the stuff about strengths and virtues and values in action from Martin Seligman and his colleagues in positive psychology. So there's a bit of that in resilience training as well, but I think there should be more of it probably and more consistent like with philosophy and modern resilience training programs. So asking yourself what your core values are and shifting your attention to those I think is important. And then another thing that's really important is a general solution, a general technique, if you like, or strategy, is that uh, the Stoics wanted to cultivate ongoing awareness called prosoche, like a kind of mindfulness. You could call it Stoic mindfulness. I think where a lot of people go wrong is that they learn self-help and self-improvement and therapy techniques, and then they use them. Like a lot of my clients will do meditation for 10 minutes every morning, or they'll do some journaling or whatever. Right. And I think there's a grave error that they're making, which is they'll do this stuff and then they'll kind of forget about it. And then they'll revert back to their kind of usual negative thinking, basically. And the Stoics warn us against that. They say that there's no point like going to the school and listening to Epictetus and maybe practicing stuff and then just forgetting about it. And once you walk out the door of the school and reverting back to all your irrational negative thinking again, right? You go back to square one. Like, so it's like Epictetus is saying, I hate to break it to you kids, but you're going to have to do this ongoing. Like, you need to do some kind of continual mindfulness practice. Otherwise, you're going to end up compartmentalizing your skills, and you're going to do them like in your bedroom for 10 minutes every morning and then just go back to what you were doing before, like, and undo like the work that you were doing in the morning. So there has to be, if it's a big overall philosophy of life, there's got to be some kind of continual improvement in our self-attention, like the Stoic idea of prosoche. And what is it the Stoics are paying attention to? Well, this is the core of Stoic therapy and the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. Epictetus said the single most widely quoted passage from the Stoics is Epictetus saying it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And that realization is, I think, more important than most readers of Stoicism actually give it credit for being. You know, we know now that simply understanding that, grasping it, and seeing it in action potentially has more profound benefits than people realized 30 or 40 years ago in the earlier phases. We used to think that getting people to grasp this idea, it used to be called cognitive distancing. Like, so grasping the idea that our opinions and our beliefs are kind of projecting values onto external events and shaping the way that we perceive them, shaping our emotions. Really grasping that, seeing it in action, people used to think was a necessary precursor to doing cognitive therapy. But increasingly now it's seen as a technique in its own right and a far more therapeutic potential than people had previously assumed. So being continually paying attention to yourself and noticing how your value judgments in particular interact with your emotions and your behavior is, I think, a foundational Stoic strategy. And then there's all these other ones that are built around it. Another one that I'll mention, we're getting really kind of, hopefully we'll grab our viewers by the scruff of the neck and challenge some of their ideas. So I work with a lot of people um, in traditional behavior therapy, CBT. One way that we look at things is there's kind of like two main elements. There's skills acquisition and skills application. So you might teach someone how to do assertiveness skills. And you train them in a session, and then you get them to go out and actually do it in the real world with real people. Or you teach them relaxation skills, and then you get them to do that when they're on an airplane, like if they've got a fear of flying or something like that. And there's an intermediate step where they might rehearse doing stuff through role play, or they might rehearse it in their imagination and apply it in those ways. They might do graduated exposure, where they start off with mildly challenging tasks, applying the skills, and then start to face more and more challenging, scarier kind of situations as they build up more and more resilience, if you like. But with the clients that I find, I think one of the shortcomings of self help is, without a shadow of doubt, most of the clients that I see have got done quite well at skills acquisition. So they're doing their journaling, they've read a gazillion books on therapy, they've done a gazillion workshops, like they've been doing a little mindfulness practices every day. But usually when they wind up in therapy, it's because the application part is a massive deficit. So it's all lopsided. Like, they've been learning a load of therapy stuff and haven't really applied any of it, like, or applied very little of it to genuinely challenging situations. And there's a reason why that happens. It's because people are naturally avoidant of things that they don't like, that they find stressful, challenging, and difficult. And the main thing that makes people less avoidant of aversive situations is the presence of another person encouraging them. So when you were 2 years old, or 3 years old, or 4 years old, it was probably your mum and dad, so you're a bit scared of dogs, right? Like, most children go through a phase where they are, typically, and your mum and dad would say it's fine, he's harmless, he's friendly, or just stroke him and it'll be okay. Or you're a bit scared, like going in the water, like swimming in the river and the sea or whatever, and your parents would say it's fine, it's okay, you'll be fine, and they'll kind of encourage you to face your fears. Basically, if you fall over, they encourage you to get back up, brush yourself off again, and stuff like that. People find it hard to do that for themselves, to kind of pull themselves up with the bootstraps. Easier. And then in adult life, they go and see a coach or a therapist or a trainer or whatever. And the trainer will go, like, face your fears and like stick with it a little bit longer than normal. Like, and you'll get over your anxiety. You'll learn to cope with it. Hard to do that from self-help alone because there's such a strong tendency towards avoidance. So that's why I see all the clients I see are like that. Like they've been practicing, but then actually learning the self-help skills, potentially, right? Brace yourself, people. This is going to come as a shock, right? Reading self-help books, doing self-help workshops, and practicing self-help skills potentially becomes a form of avoidance in itself, right? It's like when people practice something over and over again, but never go out and do it. It'd be like if you're wanted to do boxing and you're constantly practicing, but you never actually get in the ring because you're just kind of put, I'm not ready yet. Like, I'll just do some more practice. I'll just not a self help workshop. Like, I'll do a bit more meditation at home, not really facing your fears. So, genuine resilience, we have to watch, like, because a lot of people think they can build resilience by developing these skills, coping skills, and so on. But what they're often missing is the impotence to go out, face the fears, like voluntary hardship, as the Stoics called it, like actually apply things in reality. And usually, like I say, it helps if you've got someone else encouraging you to do that. Otherwise, it takes real effort, like and determination, to put yourself out there and creativity sometimes to figure out how am I going to get out of my comfort zone, like and push myself. And the Stoics, I think, are clear about that as well. We need to be consistent. Like we need to face hardship in life, be willing to do that. You can't just become wise. You can't become resilient just by, like the Epicureans, avoiding stressful situations. That's going to be a recipe for emotional fragility. Like, so I want to emphasize that because many of the people that I see are doing exactly this. They're just reading self-help books and doing workshops, and then they're wondering why they're not becoming more resilient because they're not really applying it and encouraging themselves to face their fears and get out of their comfort zone. Except dudes in the military, like, and some athletes and things like that, like, tend to be a little bit more of the mindset about pushing themselves.
Acquisition versus application. That was amazing. You gave so much there. My favorite thing to write on. So I get asked to give briefs in the military, and often they ask me to talk about stress management. And I do like to talk about that first because we need to manage what's on our plate. So we talk about the strategies, what you just highlighted, the importance of social support. If you have it, fantastic. If you don't, multiple ways to cultivate it. As you mentioned with kids, we have that support system encouraging it, and having other people around you that knowing you can do hard things, encouraging you to do so in a safe way, imperative, and then creating that experience. But when I talk about resilience, after you effectively manage what's on your plate, intentionally causing stress. So just like what Musonius Rufus would say in voluntary discomfort, intentional stress is just a reframe of that because I think the word stress is a great
Mm-hmm.
word for a reframe because I grew up thinking stress is to be avoided. It is bad. I've seen what it can do to people I love in
Yeah.
my life. If it is, at least I didn't have the awareness that it was just not being managed well and not recovering from it. So I had this negative perception of that word, but stress is essential, and pursuing it at a manageable level for a brief amount of time to practice the strategies that are beneficial for you is how you train the skill. It is resilience. And you gave so much there on how Stoicism and its foundation and those four virtues gives us the how that we can go about whatever our why may be. And one of your great chapters in your Build Your Resilience book is core values. And it's funny, when I first got trained, now 11 years ago, we did a core values exercise. But the importance of that exercise is it changes over time based on maybe getting married or having kids or a new job or
Mm-hmm.
moving. So reflecting on that continuously for knowing your why, having virtue for your how, then it doesn't matter what you do. It can be fulfilling. But man, the intentional stress, the voluntary hardship, I couldn't agree more that that is how you build the tolerance for inevitable adversity so you can build a skill in its resilience.
Mm. The world's number one most popular emotional coping strategy, without a shadow of doubt, hands down, is avoidance. It's natural, and it's subtle. People engage in many subtle forms of avoidance. But in a sense, all therapy, pretty much, and all resilience building has to be about reversing avoidance, like encouraging approach, behavior, getting out of your comfort zone, facing your fears, voluntary hardship. It's the only way, really. I think it leads on. Let's do a bit of a. Happy to do a bit of a deep dive into another aspect of this, right? There's something that increasingly over the years I have changed my opinion about, and that is that in a clinical perspective, here's a bit of a backstory. The the guy that pioneered the cognitive appraisal model of stress and emotional disturbances, a researcher called Richard Lazarus in the 1960s. Um, and Lazarus was a stress researcher, a researcher on coping. His model influenced most of the cognitive therapy models. And Lazarus said basically, when we experience stress, like when we get angry and we get anxious and suffer from other emotional disturbances, there's two main elements. Like there's the appraisal of threat and the appraisal of our coping ability. Called it the seesaw model because if I have a high appraisal of the challenge that I face, it's very dangerous and it's very likely to happen, and I have a very low appraisal of my coping ability. I'm useless and weak, and I've got no idea what to do, and there's no one backing me up. Then I'll be really stressed out. Like I'm going to feel overwhelmed. I may become really anxious, like, or really angry as a way of kind of like trying to deal with the situation. I'm going to feel that things are kind of out of control. But when we do cognitive therapy and we're dealing with people with sort of pathological anxiety, for example, there tends historically to be more emphasis on the threat appraisal, right? So someone with a phobia, for example, or panic attacks or whatever, often they're catastrophizing. So we'll often challenge the catastrophic thinking. And there's some emphasis, but like generally not like as much on the coping appraisal. But I think definitely I think there should be more, first of all. But moreover, I think for developing general resilience, there should be more emphasis on our appraisal of coping. Slightly different thing. It functions in a little bit of a different way, and I think of it as being closely related to a concept that we find in rational emotive behavior therapy, the earliest form of CBT, called low frustration tolerance. Right? So, low frustration tolerance, Ellis called I can't stand it-itis. Right? It's when people say, I can't handle this. It's too much. It's overwhelming. I can't deal with it. Right? All of those kind of expressions of a poor appraisal of coping ability. Like I can't deal like with the discomfort, the pain, the frustration, the fatigue, the difficulty, or whatever. Whereas I might say this is a really horrible, really threatening, really dangerous situation, but I'm a pretty tough guy. And I've dealt with things like this before, and I'll deal with them again in the future. I've got a bunch of strategies that I'm confident in using, and I've got some good people backing me up. And in that case, even though I might have quite a high appraisal of the threat, I might not feel that overwhelmed and stressed out because I've got such a solid, robust, and flexible appraisal of my own coping ability. And, I think the Stoics, weirdly, from the outset, have this baked into their philosophy. Funnily enough, Chris Ipist, the third head of the Stoic school, wrote a book that's lost now, annoyingly. They'll probably discover a version of it, like, decades after I'm dead. Like, that'd be a real shame. I'd love to get my hands on the Therapeuticon, like, on therapeutics of Chris Ipis. He wrote a book on psychotherapy that's lost now. We just have kind of other people referring to it. And in that book, Chris Ipis basically said something surprisingly similar to Richard Lazarus. He said there's two parts of the passions, like the pathological or unhealthy emotions. He said there's the appraisal of the threat, and then there's appraisal of what we should do and our coping ability. Basically, a very, very similar idea. So we find this in Stoicism as well. Right? And I think if we want to develop general resilience, my experience, particularly actually working with clients, is working on the level of developing a high frustration tolerance. Like is really key. And so we're talking about the behavioral side of actually applying skills and going out and facing your fears. But one of the things that will help you do that at the cognitive level would be telling yourself, I can do this. Having what's sometimes also called in psychology, we have to have like at least 6 or 7 names for the same thing, right? So there's usually lots of different bits of jargon that kind of converge on something. So we also talk about self-efficacy, which is people's confidence or belief in their ability to perform certain tasks or use certain skills, right? Self-efficacy is undoubtedly integral to general emotional resilience, without a shadow of doubt. So building self-efficacy, high frustration tolerance. So it goes from Ellis thought the key, and I kind of agree with this, is to look out for when you say, I can't handle this, it's too much, or it's so overwhelming. I think also when you say to yourself, how am I going to cope? What am I going to do? Because that implies that you don't know, like, and you're kind of lost and helpless. Those are all the voices of helplessness, fundamentally. I feel helpless and overwhelmed in this situation, right? But the strange thing is, almost always when people do that, they're underestimating their coping ability. And the reason for that is this old dog called all or nothing thinking. So when we're under stress, we revert back to more primitive ways of thinking, and we tend to think in black and white and all or nothing terms. So if I can't cope perfectly with a threat, I'll tend to tell myself I've got no idea what to do and I'm completely lost. Either way we think that we've mastered the situation or we're completely helpless, black and white, extreme, all or nothing thinking. But the reality and the resilient, flexible perspective is in between. It says, this is hard, right? It's stressful, like it's unpleasant, it's painful, like, and I'm going to make some mistakes, but I'll get through it. Like I can deal with it, right? And so Ella said it's important to acknowledge the difficulty and the discomfort, high discomfort tolerance, right? High frustration tolerance. It's important to acknowledge that, but then affirm that that doesn't mean, though, that I'm incapable of dealing with it. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. It's unpleasant, but it's not unbearable. I can handle it. And the other thing that usually goes hand in hand with that, and again, weirdly, Marcus Aurelius is quite well known as basically saying Marcus Aurelius says if you allow yourself to dwell on the whole of a problem, like the whole of like the bigger picture, like sometimes it can be overwhelming. And so he says break things down into individual components. He also says adopt the view from above in a different context, right? But when you're faced with a problem and it seems overwhelming, rather than looking at it as one big thing, he says break it down into smaller elements and then ask yourself, is this genuinely unbearable? Like, and he says you would be ashamed to say that it's unbearable. And also, he says you have the resources within you. He also says elsewhere, ask yourself, what resources and abilities has nature given you in order to deal with it? So when you're faced with something that seems overwhelming, you break it down into one step at a time, one chunk at a time, and you say, what abilities do I have? Am I capable of patience? Am I capable of reasoning? Am I capable of endurance? To some extent, like these are all abilities. I know how to do some of these things. The psychological skills, virtues, resources, coping abilities that I can bring to this. And that allows me to go from thinking, I can't handle this, to thinking, if I take it one step at a time, it might be difficult, but I can handle it. I'll get through it. And that's high frustration tolerance. That attitude, way of thinking, is what allows people to get out of their comfort zone and face their fears. But sometimes we need to challenge our assumptions and our way of thinking in order to get into that kind of self talk and that perspective. And that really, I think, increasingly as the years have gone on, seems more and more integral to me to general resilience.
And it comes back to the quote that you said with Epictetus. It's not the events that bother us, but our opinions about them. And not only the opinions of the events, but the opinions about ourselves and our ability to cope with it. So it's reappraising both the event and ourselves within it. And
Yes.
a word that I use instead of appraisal, like you said, psychologists have multiple words for the same thing. Because of you, I use the term cognitive flexibility all the time. So just what
Yeah.
other perspective could I give to a thing that I'll do in leadership clients or when I'm teaching the stress management resilience stuff is just first self awareness. I can't fix problems unless I'm aware of it. So I'm stressed. Okay, whatever those symptoms are within you that you can recognize for the earliest intervention, bring awareness to it. Then separate the stressor, the event causing it, and your stress. And then very Socrates like, let's break down each one, or Epictetus like with Socrates' influence. What do I have control over within the stressor, and what do I not?
Mhm.
And then, of course, there's a lot of control within my perspectives and cognitive flexibility that you write on so beautifully. Just give me one other, maybe charitable interpretation of what is
Yeah.
happening now to alter my view. Even considering if I'm wrong, can help with
Yeah.
my resilience. But if you have a resilient perspective like you talked about, where I can do hard things, other things I attach to myself, that's going to really boost my ability to perform.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. there are certain areas in any science where you know you're onto something when there's lots of different research that converges basically from different perspectives in different countries, using different terminology, testing different things, but they're all kind of like pointing in the same direction. You think there's got to be something there because all these different studies, like, like are all kind of pointing at this one thing. Um, that's definitely, I think, the case with this idea of flexibility versus rigidity. It's been well noted, that generally speaking, rigidity in our thinking, so like cognitive rigidity, or rigidity in our coping, like in our behavior, like is almost always associated with problems, right, in the long term. Whereas increased flexibility in thinking and increased flexibility in our coping style, our way of dealing at a practical level with situations, generally leads to more resilience and better outcomes. Like resilience is definitely tied up with getting rid of rigidity and cultivating greater flexibility on different levels, for sure. You could say that's about being adaptive to situations, right? If you're rigid, you're not adaptive. Like you're not spotting the signals, the cues, and adapting your style, modifying what you're doing, right? Um, you have to use your brain, like basically to deal with problems. Like when you're responding rigidly, you're not really using your brain. You're just kind of like on autopilot. You're not thinking. You're not modifying. You're not adjusting. You're not adapting on the fly. And that's kind of what you need to be. I think this is another problem with self-help literature, that people learn coping skills from workshops and self-help because they're not, particularly because they're not applying it. It tends to encourage them to interpret those skills in a rigid, rule-governed kind of manner. Um, Whereas people, it's been long observed that when people figure things out more from trial and error, from their own experience, they tend to be more naturally flexible and adaptive about the way that they do it, right? So somebody might learn mindfulness techniques and then they kind of start to apply them into different situations, but in ways that maybe backfire a little bit. You see that all the time. So there might be somebody who's practicing mindfulness in a social situation. And maybe it backfires by actually just making them more self-conscious than normal. It's not exactly, what they're hoping to get from it. But somebody who practices coping skills effectively will think, maybe I need to try a different skill in this situation, or maybe I need to adjust this skill. So when I like it in coaching or therapy, a client will say to me, "Hey, I took that thing that you taught me and I modified it." Like, and I think that immediately shows that they're thinking on the fly, like they're adapting things. They've got coping flexibility, right? As well as the cognitive flexibility that allows them to see things from different angles. People who have a high level of coping flexibility are known to be more generally resilient in the longer term. It leads on to, you could say also avoidance. Like when people are very avoidant, that tends to be a rigid coping style. Here's the clue, right? I think that there are kind of semantic markers, like for some of these underlying attitudinal and behavioral problems. So one of them is when people say the only way, or I had to, or I've got to, I needed to do something. Those are clues that they're rigid in their outlook. And anger, which, I mentioned, that's one of my areas of interest at the moment. I think the role of anger in resilience has been underestimated. Angry people are rigid as anything, right? So are anxious people. Depressed people have their own rigidity. Angry people are obviously rigid. Angry people will say things like, the only way I could get the kids to listen to me was by yelling at them, grabbing them by the scruff of the neck or whatever. I had to slap that guy. Like it was the only way that I could get any sense into him. And that's the voice of rigidity talking. Like, not like, I had some options here. I guess I could slap him, or maybe I could walk away and think about it and come back to him later. Or, maybe I could have just listened to him a bit more and then found out what was bothering him. Or, like that kind of dude is not angry and freaking out. Like, because he can see options ahead of him and he's evaluating them and modifying them. But the guy that thinks I had to do this feels like he's compelled into action. It's like he doesn't have control anymore. That's why people feel out of control, like because their appraisal of their coping has got desperate and rigid, and so they feel like they had no option but to do the thing that they did, which is often doing something that backfires. Angry people also tend to specialize in achieving the opposite of what they really want to achieve, like particularly in the longer term. But I think that's, to me, at the moment, anger is the kind of royal road to self improvement and resilience in a sense as well, because it's vastly neglected. And all right, brace yourself for this. I think also in the military, it's a particular issue, because anger, to some extent, in certain branches of the military, or more than others, maybe. Um, I get the impression, from what little I know, that the guys that I've spoken to in special forces like tend to valorize anger somewhat, um, maybe more than people in other branches of the military. So, some people think anger is a good thing, but there are problems with it. I'll give you an example. We know many, many, many things about anger from research. But angry people, uh, people who have high levels of state anger, like they're generally angry, die prematurely. Like they experience more accidents and injuries. They experience more mental health problems. They have poorer relationships with other people. And you add all of those things together, what it tells you is that angry people are weak. Like they're the opposite of being tough, robust, and emotionally resilient. People who are typically angry are actually vulnerable. Like they're fragile individuals. You look at the longer term evidence, like, they die prematurely. They're physically and mentally more fragile individuals who encounter more problems. And so the reason that that's so controversial is anger is kind of an illusion. When we get angry, we have what psychologists sometimes call the illusion of control. So angry people feel powerful temporarily, and yet they're weaker. Like, yet they have all of these problems, objectively speaking. So anger is an illusion that dupes us into thinking that we're powerful and resilient, when in fact the opposite is true in many cases. That's why it's kind of a puzzling, controversial, and problematic thing. But one of the problems with anger is that we know anxious people, as I think everyone realizes, when people are anxious, their brain, like, it goes into a different mode of functioning. We think, feel, act differently. Anxious people catastrophize, so they overestimate risks that they're facing. Typically, they're predisposed to do that. It's part of the nature of anxiety. Angry people do the opposite. Like, we know that angry people tend to underestimate risks. And that makes angry people, as is well known, more impulsive in their behavior and more reckless, right? So angry people are more likely to get into accidents and have other problems like that. Angry people, because they are underestimating risks and they behave impulsively and recklessly, are more likely to get themselves and other people around them killed, right? That's not something that you want in the military. When I'm talking to dudes in the military, I'll often say, this issue with underestimating risks, though, do you not think that might be kind of a problem? Because underestimating risk is a good way to get killed. And so, if people are kind of valorizing anger and encouraging it, do you kind of think this dude might get us all killed, though? Because the red mist has descended and he's not really seeing things clearly and objectively anymore. So I think there are many puzzling things about the psychology of anger that as a society we haven't fully kind of digested. We need to think through a little bit more. Um, but the Stoics saw it as the biggest psychological problem that we face. We have an entire book by Seneca on anger that survives today. And it's one of the main issues that Marcus Aurelius is concerned with in the Meditations as well. Like, it's actually one of the main themes in the Meditations. So I think the Stoics in general seem to have thought anger was a particular problem. Because not only is it damaging for the individual, but it's one of the most it's one of the most explicitly interpersonal emotions. Like, angry people cause wars, and they destroy relationships. Like, they abuse children. They cause damage not just to themselves, but to everybody around them potentially. So, in a sense, that makes anger like a more pronounced problem, even than anxiety and depression. But I don't think its role in resilience has been fully appreciated. Because of this illusion that's baked into it. Angry people, I think, tend to overestimate their own resilience, and yet, all the research points towards the fact that they're fragile, and vulnerable, like they lack resilience.
You mentioned earlier that individuals in the military and athletics are good at applying skills, right? Not only acquiring them, but of course, the systems are designed to
Yeah,
apply them. But having been in the military now for 12 years, you've given me a new term that I'm going to use quite a bit and think about, but not just cognitive flexibility, coping flexibility. Because
yeah,
in the
coping
multiple roles
flexibility.
that I've had, I've seen really resilient individuals for their jobs be messes in other aspects of their life. So the skills are there, but they're not being translated to other aspects of their life. And maybe that's through misapplications of emotional regulation. We're all prone to the general emotions. That's part of being human. But your recent writings have been incredibly powerful on anger. And you've given me both cognitive strategies and sensory approaches. Like the fist tightening one, I really enjoyed. The dial, I really enjoyed. But I agree with you that chronic anger, if you're more prone to acting upon the emotion that is anger, is a liability. It's not something that you can leverage to improve your performance over time. I'm curious when it comes to anger, are there some cases where that emotion can be beneficial? Like in life or death situations. I think of the mom that lifts the car to save her
Yeah,
child.
yeah, it's one of my favorite questions. Is there such a thing as healthy anger? And it would require a whole book to kind of really do it justice. But I think we have to distinguish between different types of anger. First of all, and then one question that we can ask is, anger could potentially be useful in any number of situations, but actually that's not, in a sense, it's not the real question. So the real question would be, is it the best response? In those situations, right? So I might be able to get my kids to do their homework by losing my temper and yelling at them, but is it the best way to get them to do their homework in the long run? So the better question would be, is anger the optimal response across the board? And it very seldom is, right? But there may be some situations where something resembling anger. So there's a distinction I would make here that's based on effective neuroscience and research on primary process emotions, which is there in evolutionary terms, if you like, there are primitive um, responses associated with anger. So the two of the most basic ones would be the anger or the aggression, I should say. So the word aggression we usually use, strictly speaking, to refer to behavior, whereas anger we usually use to refer to the emotion that's often but not always correlated with it. And people tend to confuse these two things, right? So in many situations where people think anger is helpful, what they really mean is that aggression is helpful, aggressive behavior. And many people think, well, it's the same thing. You have to feel angry in order to behave aggressively. But that's not true, right? Because, for example, boxers and martial artists exhibit aggressive, violent behavior, but they might not really be experiencing anger. And in fact, the more experienced and the more skilled they are, the less subjective feelings of anger they probably experience, right? But in the kind of situations you're talking about, so one of the most obvious forms of anger, which maybe you could compare to certain aspects of military life, is what researchers sometimes call predatory aggression. Right, one of the most simple forms of aggression, and that's when an animal is hunting other animals, right? And that's a pure form of aggressive behavior. Like an animal is hunting its prey. In actual fact, anger seems to be quite unrelated to predatory aggression because when humans also engage in predatory aggressive behavior, when we go hunting, for example, we hunt deer or something like that. But anger, most people can realize, would be unhelpful in most of the situations. Animals or humans that are exhibiting predatory aggressive behavior um, tend to prefer to be quiet and calm, like a sniper or something like that, for example, right? You want to be quite level-headed, like when you're exhibiting that kind of behavior. The emotion of anger doesn't really seem to usually contribute that much to it. Um, and then the opposite of that, or the corresponding emotion, is what's sometimes called defensive aggression, right? So animals, when they're under attack, exhibit aggressive behavior if they're being attacked by another creature that's stronger, more dangerous than them. They have to break free and try and escape, and sometimes they have to exhibit aggression to fight back. Um, but that seems to be more associated with fear than anger, right? So it could be that when a mother's trying to rescue her child, she's probably triggering what neurologists sometimes call the rage circuit in the brain, like which is we believe is kind of inherited in evolutionary terms from the kind of like panicky, almost like defensive response that animals exhibit, for example, if they're trapped or maybe caught in the jaws or caught in the claws of a predator. So you have to like violently try and break free, but it's more like driven by fear, if anything, rather than anger. So a mother in that situation, like, might be like like an animal that's trying to break free. She has this adrenaline rush, feels very powerful, but is it really anger that she's experiencing, or is it actually like a different type of emotion that's maybe even associated with slightly different regions of the brain? Here's a clue. Generally speaking, when people exhibit anger, it tends to be associated with approach behavior, right? So if I'm angry with you, I'm probably going to march right up to you and get up in your face. Like, and I'm probably going to go on and on at you. And if I'm really angry, I'm not going to let it drop. And I might prolong the confrontation for longer than is really necessary, right? Whereas if I'm experiencing defensive aggressive behavior, like you're kind of harassing me and I need to kind of break free, I might push you away and then try and get away as quickly as possible. Right. Say if you're an attacker and I've got to defend myself. And anger might be quite counterproductive in that situation. Say a woman's being assaulted by a man. Um, Getting angry might backfire potentially. Stereotypical anger, as we normally think of it, might encourage somebody to escalate the situation, to maintain the confrontation for longer than is safe. Whereas defensive aggression might be kicking somebody in the nuts and then getting out of there as quickly as possible, right? Like an animal using violence to break free from the claws of a predator and then escaping, right? That's not anger. Like that's more like fear that just happens to have co-opted aggressive behavior. So that was a little bit of a long-winded answer, but we need to have a more granular, more nuanced understanding of different types of emotional response in order to evaluate these things. So definitely aggression, like, is useful. But I think there are very few situations where the subjective emotion of anger is the best possible response. Another way of measuring that is with the clients that I work with. If I say to them, um, in the situations where they get angry, if I have them evaluate the benefits, it almost always turns out to be that speaking their mind or confronting somebody is what they actually thought was beneficial, right? So really, they're talking about assertiveness that they think is beneficial, confrontation, and then if you ask them, well, does anger actually help you to do that? Like, if you were calm and rational instead of being angry, wouldn't you be able to confront the other person more effectively, potentially? Like, in almost every single case, clients will tend to separate, if they can separate the behavior from the emotion, they usually end up concluding that the emotions are not only unnecessary, but actually it impairs their ability to assert themselves effectively.
It's a powerful distinction. The emotion of anger and then the behaviors of assertiveness or aggression.
Yeah.
That is that's the short answer, but the long-winded one you gave just gave so many great examples and tied it together. And I think of just coming back to Stoicism and looking at the dichotomy of control. When I think about when I get angry, it's typically my belief that I can control something that I truly
Yeah.
cannot. So, like, if I'm getting angry at my 4-year-old
Yeah.
son who may have just heard knocking on the door because he woke up from his nap, I'm
Uh-huh.
attempting to control another human being, or I believe I have control over something
Yeah.
is not truly true. It's a misapplied impression.
That's the illusion of control, as sometimes known in psychology. It's definitely central to anger. I think of it as kind of an illusion of power. It makes us feel more powerful when we're angry. But the weird thing about anger is that we're making some generalizations here, but sometimes I'll talk about stereotypical anger. Like typically, anger one of the peculiarities of it is that angry people are often convinced that what they're doing is right. Usually, not always, but like in many cases, anger is often quite righteous. So, and they feel like it's the only option and they have to do it in order to deal with the situation. But angry people, when they're no longer angry, very often experience regret about what they did. So it seemed like a good idea at the time, is characteristic of anger. So I felt like I had to tell my kid, I had to felt like I had to punch this guy. I felt like I had to kick a hole in the wall. It was the only way I could deal with it. And then the next day I was like, I kind of wish I hadn't done that now. Like, so that's a typical pattern of anger. There's something not right there. It shows how delusional anger often is. We're absolutely convinced of something at the time, but then often afterwards, when we're no longer angry, we're able to look back on it using our prefrontal cortex and thinking rationally and looking at the bigger picture. It seems like what we did was a mistake. And we were misjudging the situation retrospectively. Anger doesn't tend to do nuance, so it's not good at problem solving. And you need nuance in order to solve interpersonal problems usually. So it's particularly badly adapted to dealing with relationships, which is where it usually comes up. Like if you're trying to fix a leaking tap and you kind of hurt your thumb or something and you get frustrated and then it escalates into anger, you probably take your spanner or whatever and like throw it at the wall, right? And the more angry you are, the harder it's going to be for you just to kind of do the intricate stuff you have to fix a leaking tap, right? Well, if you can't even fix a leaking tap when you're angry, what chances have you got of fixing a broken relationship? Like it's like repairing a spider's web or something like that, It's not the right tool for the job. It's like using a club, when we get angry. It's too crude an instrument usually to repair problems in relationships. And yet, for many people, it's the go to thing that they revert back to. Because when we get distressed and upset, we tend to revert back to a childlike, primitive way of thinking and rigid, childlike, crude, like aggressive coping strategies, which, like we go into kind of an emergency mode, but that like when we're facing complex problems, that almost always backfires.
You mentioned the prefrontal cortex and our ability to rationalize coming from those areas, and that's just suppressed when we're emotional in any way. But anger seems to be the one that really suppresses our ability to have cognitive flexibility or
Yeah.
to use strategies in a different way.
Angry people have an impaired ability to evaluate the consequences of their actions. So the red mist descends. When you're angry, you might as well be drunk, right? Because it clouds your judgment. Like Seneca called it temporary madness, and he was right. We now know that angry people don't usually think straight. So some people will say, let's get into a little bit of a nuanced aspect to this about Stoicism, what Stoicism has to offer. So uh, Plato portrayed the mind using what's called the tripartite model. So, a kind of simplified version of this, he uses this famous metaphor of a charioteer with two horses. And so, a kind of simplified version of it is the horses are like the passions, and the charioteer is like reason. And so, the mind is kind of like sitting there and observing these passions and trying to control or manage them. That's how most people tend to think about emotional problems and bad habits and stuff like that. But anger is a really good illustration of a weakness in that model of the mind. So the Stoics explicitly rejected the tripartite model, and they said that the mind was a unified whole. And for the Stoics, when we get angry, it's not that the horses are unruly or angry, the charioteer is angry as well. Right. So anger contaminates the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, right? It gets co opted into this mess. So it's not like there's a rational part of our mind that's just sitting there calmly observing the anger and thinking about it. That's a weird illusion in a way. So when we're angry, we tend to believe that what we're doing makes sense and we don't really see the consequences of our actions because the charioteer is also angry. Right. He can't control the horses because he's just as bad as they are. Right. And that's why usually it's only after a delay when we've calmed down that we start to kind of reappraise what went on. And there are things that we could do to try and get ourselves out of anger and regain perspective. But part of the problem is it's not just a question of exerting more control. Part of the problem is that the person exerting control isn't thinking straight, right? So we need to really tackle it at a deeper level, in a sense, in order to fix the problem. I think that one of the problems with people like have with anger is they think of it too much in this way, as like I just need to take more control of my feelings, and they underestimate like the fact like the part of them that's trying to take control is also angry like and you're a collaborator in your own anger like when you're in the middle of an angry episode. So it's going to take a little bit more preparation, a little bit more nuanced thinking in order to deal with the problem. We need to anticipate in advance the type of things that trigger anger, and we need to have ways, not just of exerting control, but of actually, getting ourselves out of this hole, picking ourselves up by the bootstraps again. It's difficult. It's easier for somebody else to observe us and say, hey, do you realize what you're doing right now? Right? But it's hard to do that. It requires an unusual amount of self awareness, right? And an ability to kind of really drag the whole of your mind into a different mode of functioning. It's like being drunk or high on drugs. In fact, I'm hesitant to use this analogy, but really, the more I think about it, anger in many ways really does resemble taking a drug like cocaine. Anger is kind of addictive, like for a start. And it gives people this illusion of control and this kind of sense of power. But then the more they come to depend on it, the more anxious and paranoid and, like dysfunctional they tend to become over the longer term. But for sure, I think I like to think of overcoming anger as kind of the royal road to self improvement and building resilience for that reason.
And to your point, like fear-based parenting, for an example, through anger can be quite effective
Mhm.
acutely. So we get this feedback that this allows me to solve the problem in front of me without thinking about the downstream consequences. And
Yeah,
absolutely, when you think about the ramifications, it seems to work until it truly doesn't, or until you're so
till it
far removed
doesn't.
from connection.
Yeah, until your kids don't speak to you anymore, or you wonder why your kids are like, the way that they are, and maybe they're aggressive or hostile towards you. I think you wanted to talk a little bit about resilience in children. I think it's a really important area. Like resilience training has been done in schools because the preventative approach, like naturally people think we should get them when they're young, teach them these coping skills and stuff like that, so they don't get all depressed and anxious and whatnot later in life. It's natural to want to do that. I'll tell you, like I think the most obvious error that people make. So when people say, "How can I teach my kids about stoicism?" Like right out the gate, the very way that they're framing the question seems to me to kind of have missed the point, right? Because probably the most valuable thing that you could do for your kids would be to work on yourself first. Like, if you had really overcome your own anger and anxiety and you worked on your own resilience, like you're going to set an example to your kids that is more powerful and more beneficial than any lecture that you could potentially sit down and give them. If people come out the gate thinking, I'm going to give my kids, I need to give my kids a lecture on how to be more resilient. It'd be better to give them an example through your own conduct, personality, and behavior. But there's a flaw in this, and I think this is why people kind of fall back on thinking, I need to sit down and give my kids a lecture, right? But it's a problem with a solution that's been well known since like the 1970s, 1960s, and research and behavior therapy with children. So the problem is the kids can't see what's going on between your ears, right? They're not telepathic. Like they don't know what's going on in your head, right? So especially if you're not very communicative, you might be coping with things philosophically and resiliently. Your kids can kind of see on the outside, but they maybe don't really know what it is that you're struggling with internally. So you're not really providing a clear role model or an example. You'd provide a better role model if you were expressing what was going on inside you. So sometimes this is called the talk aloud technique. So you might say to your kids, "Man, I'm really tired at the moment, and I'm kind of finding it hard work, like to accomplish this task, you know." But if I take it one step at a time and I just keep focusing on like how satisfying it's going to be when we get to the end of it, like that's helping me to get through it. So providing what's called the coping model, like so explaining sometimes when you're struggling, but then providing a good example of how you come back from that. Kids can learn from that. But if you don't acknowledge your struggles, like and you don't express what's going on in between your ears, then your kids don't have that much to model, like except what little they can observe going on the outside, right? So I think because people don't realize that, like, they give up prematurely on modeling stuff to the kids and they revert back to this kind of crude approach of let's sit them down and give them a lecture. I'll tell them to go and read a book or something. Maybe that'll get it in their head, right? Because there's a lot more that you could do by working on yourself and modeling your own behavior to your kids in order to develop them, to help them develop resilience. But the deeper things would be I know people want techniques, like here's a little visualization technique or whatever. But sometimes the most important things are deeper philosophical shifts. And one of them would be like the values stuff we mentioned earlier. So, modeling an attitude that's more about the journey than the destination, that places more value on your kid's character than on their achievements. Um, and being self-aware, like exhibiting self-awareness to your kids, encouraging them to be self-aware is important. Another thing that's really obvious is that for some reason, when we want people to change and when we want ourselves to change, um, the way to do that is if your kids throwing darts at a dartboard and they kind of uh, they miss the bullseye, but they're kind of getting progressively a bit closer to it. You could say, "Well done for making an effort. You're getting closer each time. Just keep it up, and you'll get there eventually." Or you could say, "That was garbage. You missed. You're obviously completely hopeless at this." Right? Um, So it's not rocket science, you know? So you could criticize. Usually, feedback is beneficial if it's more specific and solution focused and targets the actual behavior, right? And encourages effort. Like it praises people and reinforces them for the effort they make. And it praises and reinforces them for progress that they're making, like even if it's partial or incomplete. Like, so you got closer that time, well done, rather than you missed it again, you're an idiot, right? That would be like all or nothing thinking. All right. So unless you hit the bullseye, you're a failure. So if you're 99% there, if you get right next to it, it doesn't matter, you failed. Rubbish. Right. So that just demotivates people and causes them to give up. Right. Whereas even if your kid got 1% closer, you might think if I encourage that, like then next time they might get 2% closer, and next time 3%, and they'll get there eventually. Right. So praising even small incremental improvements, we know from animal training, like, and from all research and education shows that that's more beneficial, but it requires patience and it requires getting beyond black and white, all or nothing thinking. In the same way, it's amazing. I would say it's almost the norm that internally adults do this crazy thing of condemning themselves harshly for failing to meet high standards, rather than praising themselves for effort and partial success. So, it's incredibly common for people who are anxious or depressed, like to be too harsh on themselves in that way. And if you ask them why they're doing it, they'll say, well, to try and motivate myself to achieve success. But you see, but if you did that to a kid, would it motivate them to succeed, or do you not think like it would really obviously do the complete opposite and demotivate them, right? So I think when it comes to working with kids, we have this tendency to do that in particular, to self-flagellate. And sometimes people do it with kids. It's more obvious if you're doing it externally. So people, I don't think, do it quite as much like with other people. They do it more with themselves. But still people do it sometimes with kids, and realizing the effort it's important to encourage, and small approximations towards the target behavior are important to encourage. So a key thing in therapy would be there's a tendency for us to evaluate people's character as a whole, our own and other people. Like, you're useless, you're an idiot. And it's generally unhelpful to do that because it can be sort of overwhelming. It just demoralizes and depresses people, but it doesn't give them any guidance. So say we role played a job interview, and at the end of it, you say, "How do you think I did?" And I say, "I just think you're a useless idiot and completely unemployable." Right? You might think, "Well, that's not constructive feedback, Donald." Right? Because apart from the fact it's kind of severe, right? It's so generalized and character based. It doesn't kind of like give me any clues about what I should do differently next time. Whereas if I said, I thought when you answered one of the questions, you went on too long, or when you answered another question, you should have given a more specific example of such and such, then you might go, okay, I know what to do differently next time now, right? But it's almost kind of laziness in a way when we give feedback. Like, if we give, generally speaking, more specific action based feedback tends to be better. So to build resilience in kids, by when we do that, like, not only are we helping them to improve, but we're encouraging a general mindset that's going to be healthier for them in the long term, and it's going to contribute to emotional resilience. Whereas if we're too punitive in our criticism, it's funny because people will say, I know this sounds obvious, right? But people will say, I think you need to be hard on kids to toughen them up, right? But usually what they mean by that has the opposite of the desired effect, right? It doesn't really work. Like, encouraging progress is really the key thing, right? So I think we need to bear that in mind when we're talking to kids. Like, it takes patience and encouraging successive approximations. Um, Even in animal training, like, that's the case. You might get your dog to raise its paw to beg for food, and it kind of raises its paw a little bit. You wouldn't whack it like and tell it that's a failure, you're useless. You kind of give it a treat for raising its paw a little bit, and then next time, if it raises it a little bit more, you give it another treat, and then eventually it'll do the trick. Like, but I guess you could see this as a problem of high standards or perfectionism or rigidity or black and white thinking, however you want to frame it. That's the kind of thing that's important to avoid if we want our kids to be resilient.
So much wisdom there. I'm not. I've become less of a fan of labeling things. I still catch myself when I label another person or label something, but I've learned over time that that's a very limiting, rigid behavior when it's people and even situations that have multiple explanations for them. But one thing I'm a fan of labeling of, thanks to my wife, and doing it out loud, and I've gotten much better at over time, is labeling my emotions, labeling my feelings,
Yeah,
expressing where I'm at so they can see in real time how I'm feeling, and then bring not only awareness to
yeah,
them, I can talk, I'm working through it, but awareness to myself. So if I label feelings out loud, there's my self awareness. So if I'm saying I'm angry, now I can catch myself and start using strategies or people that can support me. So tying back that
yeah.
awareness piece to the application, it starts with awareness.
Yeah, like, definitely, there's a lot of good solid evidence that shows that emotional labeling is helpful, therapeutic, and a whole there's many reasons for that. I'll just tell you some things very briefly, just show like to unpack that a little bit, right? Most strong emotions transport our attention away from the present moment. So if I'm anxious and worried, I'm probably thinking about what if this happens, what if that happens in the future. When I'm angry, I'm usually kind of thinking about the outcome of an action as well. Angry people tend to be quite oblivious to what they're doing. But the more your attention is shifted into the future or into the past or into the realm of fantasy away from the present. It's like taking your hands off the steering wheel. You kind of have less control over your own emotions and thinking and behavior the more you allow yourself to be transported into and lost in thought, basically. But labeling your emotions brings your attention back and grounds it in the present moment. That's where your locus of control is, right? So that's one reason why it's important. It's inherently antagonistic to emotions like anger, depression, and anxiety, right? So depression tends to be more absorbed in ruminating about the past. But if you go, right now, I notice that my heart's beating faster than normal, right? That drags you out of rumination about the past or worry about the future or hypothetical stuff. It focuses you, grounds your attention on the reality of the present moment. Like, so it snaps you out of the trance, like of depression or worry, and it puts you back in the driving seat where your locus of control is situated. So I'd say it's useful to begin it by saying right now. That's what I advise people to do so that they're explicitly focusing their attention on the present moment. And then other sneaky things you can do is you can phrase it in the third person, right? So you could go, right now, I notice that Kyle starting to get a little bit angry about stuff. So that kind of forces you, snaps you into third person, like observer perspective on your own behavior. If you want to do that, that can be helpful. Or another one is verbification, from Korzybski in general semantics. Like Albert Ellis was really big on that. So the most famous example is catastrophizing or awfulizing, where we take a noun or an adjective and we turn it into a verb, right? Sounds weird, but it forces you to take more responsibility for it and to see it as a process that you're engaged in. So rather than going, this is a catastrophe, I go, I'm catastrophizing it. Then you might think, well, why am I doing that? How am I doing it? Why don't I stop catastrophizing it, right? But you could say, right now, I notice that Kyle is angering himself towards his kids, right? So you could turn into a verb, or you could say, right now, I notice that Kyle is making himself angry. You're taking more active responsibility for the behavior and seeing it more as a process that you're currently engaged in, but could have a beginning and a middle and an end, right? Puts you more, even more in the driving seat. And in some situations, it could be useful also, even to think of that label as a kind of abstraction. So, I particularly with anxiety, I tend to say to people, imagine you've got like a label and you've written the word anxiety on it, a big white label, and you're slapping that label on your experience in this situation. But I want you now to imagine you're peeling the label back because it's just a word, really, and looking at what's actually underneath it. So, when you say I'm anxious, what do you actually experience? What's under that label? So your heart's beating faster and your like hands are shaking maybe and your muscles are kind of like tense. But aren't those all kind of pretty banal physical sensations really? Some of them are more voluntary than others. Like the tension you could kind of stop doing to some extent. It creeps up on you, but you can also let go of it. It's kind of semi-voluntary. Some of it's involuntary, like your heart beating fast. There's nothing you can do about that except just kind of ride it out and accept it. But your heart beats fast when you get excited or if you're running. So why is it such a big deal? There's a lot of research that shows that we construct our emotions, and that when we label our emotions, we kind of change the way that we subsequently respond to them. So the physiology of excitement and anger and anxiety are quite similar, right? If we peel back the label and have a more granular awareness, that potentially can take away some of the second order feelings that we have, like anxiety about anxiety or shame about anxiety. And it also potentially gives us more control. What does this anxiety look like if we kind of open it up? Like we look under the hood. So really, it's my heart beating fast, my hands are like shaking, like I'm feeling a bit warm. Like each of these things individually seems kind of harmless, So why is it when I call it anxiety, it seems like such a big deal, right? So kind of normalizing, naturalizing things, dissecting them. There's a guy called Bauduin who was an early psychotherapist at the beginning of the 20th century, who was into Marcus Aurelius and wrote about him. And he calls this method, which he derives from Stoicism, but it's very similar to stuff that we find in third wave CBT today. He calls it the method of depreciation by analysis. And he says it's like a child that pulls apart a toy into all its components and thinks, is that all that's really inside this? Is that all it's really made from? In acceptance and commitment therapy, they call it the tin can monster technique. They say, imagine you went into your attic and you saw this thing looming over you and thought, oh my God, what's that? And then you look closely and it's just some old tin cans that the kids have put together with bits of string. Like, and they say, if you think of your problems, particularly your emotions in that way, you think it's just hands shaking, heart beating like individually, none of these things are overwhelming or scary. Like, but when I lump them all together and slap the label anxiety on it, maybe I make it seem like more a big tin can monster, like more frightening than it actually is.
In the
So
bu-
these are all variations of what you described, which is the kind of effective labeling strategy.
and then you can reappraise what you're feeling in the build up to our conversation today. I noticed my heart was beating a little faster. I was feeling a little antsy. My breathing was changed. And you could say, I'm really nervous. I'm about to talk to Donald Robertson. A lot of people will probably be watching, even more.
Terrifying.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. If I fail, I'll be laughed at by everybody. Or I'm really excited because I get to talk to literally one of my favorite authors alive about one of my favorite concepts and skills that is resilience. And this conversation today has exceeded every expectation that I had. It has been absolutely amazing. I, yeah.
Been a pleasure.
Wow. I should have scheduled 10 hours for us to talk because I feel like I've gone through half of my list of things that we could talk
Uh-huh.
about, scratch the surface on some of them. But holy smokes, are you a wealth of wisdom and information? And I cannot thank you enough for talking today.
It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Take care, Donald. Thank you again.
You too. Cheers then. Bye bye.
Cheers.